Hi, welcome to Chapter 3 of Human Learning. In this chapter, we're going to be talking about behaviorism and classical conditioning. Before we begin, I want you to remember that earlier we talked about, or you read about, early research relying a lot on humans reporting their thoughts, doing a lot of introspection, looking inside their heads, and describing what they were thinking. This is also a part of psychoanalysis, some early theories of counseling. But this came under some criticism because this was more of a subjective way of gathering information. It couldn't easily be repeated, it couldn't be verified because it couldn't be observed. And so this led to behaviorism. Some basic assumptions of behaviorism include the idea that principles of learning should apply equally to different behaviors and to a variety of animal species. So, throughout this chapter, as we talk about behaviorism, if you see the term organism, know that this refers to any species, human or non human. And then, when we talk about being objective or objectivity, realize that in behaviorism, they're going to assume that the learning process can best be studied when the focus of the study is on stimuli and response. And the reason is because you can remain more objective and focus on things that can be observed and things that can be measured. As we study behaviorism, there's also the belief that internal processes should be excluded from scientific study. So, as I stated in the introduction, behaviorism was a response in part to early research, which relied on the introspection and self reporting. They also believe that learning involves a behavior change and that organisms are born as blank slates. This is the idea that organisms aren't born with predispositions to behave in any certain way, but basically that they come as blank slates and their environmental experiences gradually begin to write on their slate. Another concept or idea related to behaviorism is that learning is largely the result of environmental events. We use the term conditioning rather than learning when we're talking about behaviorism, and this idea makes learning a more passive event. So think about this as a child. If a child or a human is born as a blank slate with no predispositions, then everything that happens in the environment begins to condition them to be a certain way. I want you to think about this as you read this chapter and see if that's your philosophy of how people develop and learning takes place. And then the last assumption is that the most useful theories tend to be parsimonious ones. Basically, this means that it would be best to explain all learning in the most concise way using the fewest principles. Next, we're going to talk about classical conditioning. The psychologist that is credited with the development of classical conditioning is Ivan Pavlov. And you may have heard of Pavlov's dog, you may have seen videos or things of his experiments in another psychology class. But basically, what Pavlov did was he used a neutral stimulus, which was the bell, and he presented the neutral stimulus right before the unconditioned stimulus, which was the meat. And this led to an unconditioned response, which was the salivating. And eventually he was able to ring the bell without producing the meat, and the dog would still salivate. And so what he said had happened was that the dog had learned or had been conditioned to associate the ringing of a bell with the presentation of meat. So make sure that you read through these different terms, the neutral stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus, and then unconditioned response, because on an exam you may be given a situation and have to label these different parts. So think about it. Ringing a bell doesn't necessarily, cause you to salivate, and the meat is a stimulus for salivation, but it hasn't been conditioned yet. And then the unconditioned response was that when the bell was rung, then the dog would begin to salivate. And here's just a funny kind of illustrating that. Let's look at some examples of classical conditioning in human learning. First, we have aversions and or other involuntary responses. And so, as a human, we may have an aversion to something because of an experience that we've had. If you take some other counseling courses or psychology courses, you'll see that people may develop an aversion to a certain type of food because they got sick after they ate it one time. And so in their brain, that food is related to or connected with being sick. Fears and phobias, same things. Bad experiences with dogs, bad experiences on an elevator, and things that cause us to have some involuntary responses. The fear of failure, and also some different attitudes. You'll see here that I've attached a video that explains the Little Albert experiment, and this will show you probably an inhumane now experiment that was conducted years ago with a baby called Little Albert, showing how classical conditioning could take place in humans. Another phenomenon in classical conditioning. If you look in your book on page 38, there are 8 phenomena or byproducts of classical conditioning. I want you to read through these, and if asked on your exam to give an example, you would be able to do this. I'm going to go through these briefly, and then you read them more carefully in your textbook. First, we have associative bias. This is where the associations are made between certain stimuli and they tend to be stronger than associations between other stimuli. So for some reason, one thing will cause the fear, the phobia, the nausea, whatever it might be, and something similar will not cause that type of response. The importance of contingency. Then we have extinction. This is the repeated presentation of the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus, and they found that this eventually led to no response to the conditioned stimulus. So if Pavlov had continued to ring the bell without presenting the meat, eventually the dogs no longer salivated at the ringing of the bell, and so the stimulus had lost its effect. Spontaneous recovery is the recurrence of a conditioned response when a period of extinction is followed by a rest period. So he waited a day or so and then began to ring the bell, and the dogs once again salivated. Generalization. When learners respond to other stimuli in the same way that they respond to a conditioned stimulus, you saw this in the Little Albert video. He was conditioned to fear the white rat, but later he also became afraid of a rabbit, a dog, a white fur coat, and any other white furry objects. Stimulus discrimination. This is almost the opposite of the generalization. An organism learns to discriminate between two similar stimuli and does not respond the same way to the two. So they may be afraid of one type of dog and not another. May be afraid of a spider but not a roach or something like that. Then we have our higher order conditioning, and this would be where another neutral stimulus is presented along with the conditioned stimulus, and we still get the same type of response. Sensory preconditioning. This is very similar to the higher order conditioning, and it explains why certain neutral stimuli may become a conditioned stimuli for a conditioned response. If you look on page 41 in your book, you'll see the example about school and test anxiety. And if you'll read that and kind of get that straight in your head, that will explain um, this sensory preconditioning. And then the last concept that we're going to talk about is systematic desensitization. And what happens here is that we have a person who is afraid of something or becomes sick in certain situations and different things. There's an anxiety provoking stimulus, and this should only be done, under the care of a professional, because you can mess somebody up or cause a lot of anxiety if it's misused. But what we do is we present the anxiety provoking stimulus slowly. And as the person's anxiety rises, then we teach them some relaxation or help them talk through it or breathe through it until eventually we can present the anxiety provoking stimulus without great anxiety. An example of this, let's just take a basic, someone's afraid of a dog. So you might talk about dogs, you might look at pictures of dogs, read a book about dogs, until this person becomes so anxious and they don't want to talk about it. Then the next time you might go to the pet store and look at dogs in the glass, and then you might see a dog in a cage. Then you might have them put their finger through the cage and touch the dog. Then you might another time bring a dog in on a leash or where someone's holding it, until eventually they can handle being around the dog without experiencing great anxiety.